Hello everyone, how you guys doing? Hopefully you're having a wonderful day. Today we are here with a video on why modern soccer cards are doomed to fail, and sort of going over the current state of modern, at least as far as I see it from my lens over the last couple years. Hopefully you enjoy the video. I know it's going to be a bit negative, but we'll sort of talk about that before we get into it. As a little prelude before we get diving on into it, we'll start by saying, as I just mentioned, I know that this isn't generally what people want to hear, I guess just depending on what side of the fence in terms of a collector, flipper, investor, gambler, whatever you are, you may feel differently, but ultimately, this isn't easy, and this isn't something I love doing. I mean, I try to help, and that's sort of the next part is I mean well by making these sorts of videos. I know some people might not like it, but just understand that even if you don't agree or don't like what I'm saying, that it is important to sort of see things from a different point of view and at least, hear me out. So please give me that chance. Continuing, I wish I could like ultra modern. I would like to throw that out there. I'm not someone that is, like a vintage stan. I have slowly gotten more into vintage, and that's definitely what I'm enjoying. But in terms of how I approach the hobby, it was never my intent to never buy modern cards. But ultimately, that's sort of where I've been led. And the final part is obviously no financial advice. These are just pieces of cardboard with dudes on them, and I am just a random guy on the internet yelling. So ultimately, think for yourself, decide on your own, and, just take these things that I talk about as sort of a data point to compare. So to start, we'll take a look at the past. Here it says last year, but we have the full graph. We'll sort of break down the last year a bit more as we go, but ultimately you can see that soccer cards were not really something that was all that big until 2020, when it sort of gained a lot of momentum, mostly by new entrants that were coming into the space, realizing that there were soccer cards and sort of getting on into it. And as you can see, there was a massive spike, as far as I'm aware, a much bigger spike than you see in basically any other sport. Most sports were maybe 5x what they were prior. Soccer went up like 15x. It was pretty crazy. Now it's come back down a bit, a little less than halfway, I would say. So it's definitely come back down. And as you can sort of see here at the end, at least, at the very, very end right here, there's sort of like 6 months in here where things have been pretty flat. So looking here, basically when we go through the changes that have been occurring, the last year was down 27%, in the last 6 months 1%, and then up 4% and 1% depending on what monthly change you want to look at. Ultimately, from what I can see, the last 6 months are a very good sort of data point in the sense that it's been pretty consistent, so you can actually compare. Obviously, when things are booming this high or busting like they were, it's very hard to get relevant data because everything's sort of moving collectively. But the last 6 months to a year is a pretty good spot. Even though we're down 27% in the last year, I feel like most things have been pretty stable. And even though we're not up much in the last 3 months, I feel like things have been moving kind of up a bit more than it's shown here. I think part of the issue is that a lot of things in this index don't sell often enough to really give you a true gauge of what's happening at that moment. Instead, you sort of get a delayed reaction. And so I think the last year has been pretty steady, and I think the last few months have actually been, better than this would indicate, at least from my point of view. Also, don't get me started on it, but indexes, especially soccer indexes, are really tricky in the sense that the people that make these indexes don't really know what people in soccer want. They're just kind of throwing a ton of cards together that they think people like, and they're very off base is what I'd say. But ultimately, it is what it is, and I think that holistically, you get a pretty good sense by this graph. So we're going to take a look at some of the best performing players or some of the biggest names over the last year and sort of how they've been doing. So here we have Kylian Mbappe. I think a lot of people would say, oh, he's not that great of a performer. Well, PSG's, a couple wins away from being a Champions League winner, which would be huge for Mbappe, and Mbappe's on the precipice of moving to Real Madrid. So ultimately, in, a hobby sense, those are pretty big things. And as we can see here from this 2017 Topps Chrome over the last year, it's down 31%. Now, that's a pretty high seal that we're originally comparing to, so you could say it's a bit more stable than that, and I would agree. But ultimately, you can see it's not anything impressive. And I know base isn't really in vogue at the moment. People like the colored, numbered stuff, and I'll bring some of that up as well. So I picked these cards at random also. Don't think that I'm out here sort of, sourcing the one card that looks good or bad. I mean, this one, as you can see, actually looks kind of good. This one's up 18%. This is the blue 2018 Prism. But again, that's a pretty good sale at the end. If we go by the earlier sale in March, that would have been lower than our initial point. So, I would say that net this is probably about even, but the last sale does make it look pretty good, so there is that. All in all, Kylian Mbappe not really doing all too much, despite PSG, doing pretty good in Champions League and the impending move that Kylian Mbappe is going to have. We'll take a look next at Haaland. Again, Haaland, whatever. People will say, oh, he's not as good as he should be. I mean, he's top goal scorer in the Premier League this year. They won a treble last year, broke a record last year, and this year, possibly even more trophies. I mean, it's absolutely crazy. I mean, very probable more trophies are on the way. But essentially, as you can see by the pricing, basically has done nothing. The boom that we see here is actually sort of the boom when he got into the Premier League and started doing good things and people got excited. And then since then, it's just sort of been a fall off with no real signs of sort of an upswing on the way, at least as far as I can tell. Now, of course, again, this is a base card. It is a Sapphire PSA 10 though, which, warrants $330, but these haven't done really anything. I mean, for a while, as you can see here, they were pretty steady at $700-800, and that's what I came to expect for a long time. And ever since then, I mean, now we're down to nearly 300, which is a pretty tough hit, especially for a player like Haaland that's still, a world beater by all means. Looking at his gold auto chrome from 2019, this one has only sold twice and, pretty deep pockets both times. So hard to really compare, but I wanted to grab some sort of numbered and see what that did. And this has been a bit more steady, no doubt. But ultimately, when you have a card like this, it's probably easier to be a bit steady when there's only one sale in almost 2 years really happening. So next up, we have a really good performer, probably, I mean, the standout of the year. I don't even know who would be close really from a holistic hobby standpoint, and that is Jude Bellingham. Here we have a gold atomic from Merlin out of 50. This one's up 15%. Again, sort of make of it what you will. I do think that the first sale in here probably is a pretty high point. So if you go from down here, about doubled in price, maybe a little more, given what he has done this year at Real Madrid. Of course, keep in mind, I mean, he did absolutely everything you could have hoped for. He went to one of the biggest teams in the hobby, which is always going to be a huge thing, and then he proceeded to basically have the best year you could have ever asked for from a midfielder getting transferred to one of the biggest teams in the world. So, going up double seems justifiable very easily, I would say. If we take a look at a Sapphire, though, on the other hand, hasn't really done much of anything. This 2020 Topps Chrome Bundesliga Sapphire, pre-move, I guess, well, in 2022, it was, $100, $150. Before the move, it was down to around 100, sometimes lower, sometimes higher. Now it's, again, between 100, 150. Nothing really crazy going on here. So sure, some of the numbered stuff may be going off the rails, but more of the accessible Jude Bellinghams really aren't doing much of anything. Now, it is a pop 585, which in soccer is a relatively high number, but at the same time, I mean, that's not any sort of astounding number that is absolutely off-putting, at least, from my eye. Taking a look at some of the lesser names, but still great players and still players that are having great years. We have Phil Foden here. His holo from 2018, PSA 9, has gone down 7% in the last year or so. There are some, kind of high sales here and, some low sales as well. It's pretty sporadic, as all things are in cards. It's, a time-to-time auction-to-auction basis where things can go up and down. But net being down 7% when he's had the year that Phil Foden's had is pretty disappointing, I would say. Now, of course, you could say, I mean, this is a silver or hollow, so it's not, necessarily one of the numbered cards, but ultimately, I needed a card that actually had some sales. I actually also think that Card Ladder didn't have really any Phil Fodens in it, so I couldn't get a nice looking graph, but, maybe some of the numbered stuff did a little better, but, I mean, looking here, this is really nothing from a player that's done really, really good this year, and is, I guess, not sort of surprised. That's part of the problem, is a lot of these players, people know they're known commodities, and so when they have a good year, it's not necessarily an astounding, revolutionary sort of thing. Vinicius is another player, along the same lines, not a hobby darling, but, knocking on the door, and here his PSA 9 Optic Holo from the same year as Phil Foden is down 13% over the last year. Again, a year that's been pretty stable, I would say, and this PSA 10, only a pop 46, has done really nothing over the last year. Florian Wirtz was one that I expected actually, some sort of uptick. Now, to be fair, this isn't sort of the card you would think of for Florian Wirtz, but it's the only card, again, I could find in Card Ladder. They're not very good at, having a big selection of soccer players, so, it is what it is. But I think that this speaks to part of the problem that we'll get to a bit later, is that there are so many different cards to pick from for these players, right? The notable ones I was showing earlier, like, I mean, Vinicius and Phil Foden, I mean, the optics are known commodities. People know about the optics. Those are like such notable cards for these players, and they're not really getting any love. And I think part of that is because you have, color wheels and all these sorts of other cards coming out for these players that then distract money, distract attention from what, in my opinion, are the true cards of those players, the truly collectible cards, or at least from a base standpoint, those should be, right? Those should be the pillar, and then everything else should branch out from there. But ultimately, there's so many different items that people are sort of having thrown at them in soccer that, your attention gets thrown so many different ways that it's really hard to stick to something, right? And so even Florian Wirtz, who's having an amazing year, Bayer Leverkusen, obviously just astounding, by all imagination, nothing anyone could have expected, and this card is down, 43% over the last year, and, honestly, probably, even more if you go from that $700 sale. This is going from the $400, and even that's not really performing all that well. I threw Jamal Musiala in here. I figure we'll throw another Bundesliga guy. Obviously, Bayern, not having the season you'd love to see, but even him, a player that seems pretty fundamental towards both Bayern and the German team going forward. His Sapphire PSA 10 is down 40% over the last year. And so all that to say, we just looked at Musiala, Florian Wirtz, Phil Foden, Jude, Vinicius was in there as well, Haaland, Mbappe, and basically, no one's up. Sure, that Mbappe color's up. You can sort of find the oddball that has a little bit of an upswing, but even then, nothing's really going up despite all of the things these players are doing, right? And so that leaves me with the question. Simply put, we have great players, we have standout cards, we have notable seasons, and we have absolutely no movement. So why is this? What is going on? And I think that that's an interesting question. I'll throw out some ideas that I have in terms of why we are in this spot. Would love to hear your thoughts down below, especially, if it relates to what I'm about to talk about, agree, disagree, whatever it may be. I'm interested what other people think, because ultimately, I'm just one guy. I don't have the answers. No one does, but collectively, I think that we can, sort of put our minds together and be able to think this one through. So the first thing that comes to mind for me is that the casino of gambling on modern players is probably closed, at least it seems to me. COVID was a time where we were ripe for this sort of thing, where day-to-day, week-to-week, month-to-month performances were going to skyrocket or totally bust a player's price because everyone was at just a fever pitch for that type of stuff. And ultimately, it seems that that's sort of dissipated. I think a lot of the gambling flipper, crew have sort of moved on to other things, whatever it may be. Some of them actually just gambling at this point and going to casinos and betting tons of money. Other ones, probably moved on to different sports because soccer isn't the easiest to sort of have a flipping culture in. I've noticed that as well. A lot of the show guys don't really do as much soccer anymore, and no gripe towards them. I totally understand it, but that's something you have to consider. And so I think that the type of person that was gambling on soccer prospecting probably isn't doing it as much anymore. I think another aspect that's, maybe a bit underrated is that Messi and Ronaldo have had such a lasting impact on the people that are in soccer that we almost expect this sort of thing out of the new guys. And so if any of these guys don't turn out to be Messi or Ronaldo for the most part, they're not really even cared about all that greatly, unless it's someone that's on your team or someone you're actively rooting for, whatever it may be. A great example of that is Neymar. Obviously not a modern guy, but basically, the hobby as a whole has almost forgotten about Neymar because he wasn't Messi or Ronaldo, because he wasn't the absolute top player. And so I think that can be extended to the more modern cards. If you're not someone that is going to astound us the way that Messi or Ronaldo have, then, why would I go buy your cards when I could just buy their cards instead? And I think that that's a very reasonable take to have. And that dovetails into the next one, which is that if you go back and look, here I have Cruyff. This is from a recent video that I did where I looked through the top 25 players of all time and how many $500 or more sales they had in the last year, along with the all-time high price in the last year. And essentially what you'll see is that someone like Johan Cruyff, which by most accounts is probably like the 5th best player of all time, somewhere around there, he's only had 35 sales of $500 or more. That's an incredibly low number to even start to grasp when you think about the amount of $500 or more sales that a lot of modern players have. I'll probably do a video on this here soon, comparing, or maybe, sort of throwing out $500 or more sales for modern players compared to past players and how out of whack this all is. But ultimately, if you are someone that's, actually looking at this somewhat analytically, or maybe you're on the outside looking in and you say, well, the fifth best player of all time has 35 $500 sales in the last year. Why should insert modern player here have thousands or hundreds, whatever the number may be, depending on the player? But it is a really important question to ask, and I think it has to play a factor to other people and how they operate, right? I think in a space like baseball, prospecting makes a ton of sense because ultimately, if you want the best of the best players of all time, it's not cheap. It's not easy. Right? Those things are so well developed that you can't attain it, and thus prospecting might be your only way to sort of get there, right? With soccer, that's not the case in the slightest. It's the furthest from the case. And so I think that has to play a factor. And then next we have box breaking, or just box prices in general, really, but I think both sort of go hand in hand. And the real issue here is that the prices of modern wax are just so egregious, again, compared to soccer. Like I said before with baseball, I can understand high prices in baseball because, again, you can't buy some of the best stuff of all time. But for the price of almost any modern product, you could buy a Messi rookie, right? Maybe it's a low grade, maybe it's not the 71 bis, whatever it is, but you could buy a Messi rookie, right? And so could you ever hope to hit anything close to a Messi rookie in terms of hobby value from one of these boxes? Probably not. Unless you're hitting a one of the best players or something to that extent, you're playing a losing game, and it's never going to really work out all that well. And people know this going in. I mean, it's all gambling. People know it's a low ROI. But in terms of hobby value, I think that the amount of product being put out in soccer compared to what you can actually get out of this stuff is just such an egregious disparity that I think that people are just getting taken time and time again. And they do it in the sake of having fun and gambling, but ultimately at the end of the day, it's going to hurt modern prices because that's a lot less money that they have to go and spend elsewhere. And finally, I think that this is a bit of an issue, but it's sort of consensus, and that's what I was alluding to with the Florian Wirtz card that we looked at, in the sense that people don't even really know what cards to chase after. I mean, if you sat down and sort of went through year to year from, like, say 2014 to modern day, what sets are collectible, right? I know most people would probably say, oh, well, 2014 Prism, 2017 Chrome. Sure. Part of the issue I have with that is, if you think that 2014 Prism is and 2017 Chrome is, well, then every year should be. And most people don't think every year of it is collectible, which almost in and of itself is sort of a question worth asking and worth delving into. But beside that, there's not a ton of sets that are really collectible. And if there's not a ton of sets that are really collectible, then how could you ever hope that, insert modern set here that you're buying that's 10 times X produced than any other set before, with 10 times the competitors in terms of other sets than ever before? How can you hope that that's going to maintain value? And I think that that's just, again, another driver in terms of having way too much supply of cards for the demand of collectors. And so we end with, does this change? Will it ever change? I think that that's a question worth asking. And initially I had this as, how does it change? But then I ended up saying, does it ever? I don't know. First off, I think what has to happen is there has to be less gamblers. There has to be. I think people, and this will happen over time, typically people come into the hobby as gamblers chasing modern product and either quit or sort of go back and chase older stuff. And so I think that we sort of need to sift through that and have these people figure out what they're actually here for. Because ultimately, if you're here to gamble, in my opinion, there are so many better ways. Well, I know for a fact there are so many better ways to gamble in terms of ROI, but even in terms of fun, I think that there are more fun other ways to gamble than, box breaking per se. Then next we have less releases, and this is a tough one because at the end of the day, the manufacturers do not want less releases. They want more and more and more. They want to daze and confuse you with as many sets as possible and just have you open up your wallet for them. And I mean, as we can see, that's sort of happening in soccer. People are just going after essentially every single release without really asking themselves, who's the end consumer for this release? Are there even people that want to collect this set? What's the point? And, you know, most of the gamblers don't care. They just want to gamble. And so this sort of goes hand in hand. If there are less gamblers, there will be less releases. And, you know, sort of, you know, going into that, there will be a price drop in boxes, which is also super, super necessary at this moment. Box prices cannot be starting at, you know, multiple $100s and, you know, often going between $500 and whatever. You can't have those sorts of prices in soccer, a sport that is so underdeveloped, and you're asking people to pay, you know, like semi-grail prices for modern product when the return on investment in terms of a collecting sense is practically 0 to none. I mean, you're getting nothing worthwhile for a collector from modern product, and you could alternatively go buy almost anything in soccer. I mean, you know, $500 in soccer could buy you almost everything, like 99.99% of things out there in soccer, you could buy with $500. And if you really wanted to, that's going to give you so much more collecting value than buying whatever you're going to get from a modern product. And again, I understand they're gamblers, there's people that want to chase this stuff, I get it, but you can only get burnt so many times before something has to change. And lastly, we need more smart collectors. I think we need those gamblers to sort of either figure out if this space is right for them, and if it is, transition to being a smart collector, transition to being someone that's thoughtful about what they're buying. And that's not necessarily saying, well, I only buy one of ones, or I only buy game use patches, or I only buy this or that. I mean, it is good to be able to pare down what exactly it is that you want to buy, but you have to be so laser focused on what it is you like, and also sort of taking into account what it is other people like. And we have to come to some sort of consensus in terms of what we are willing to put money into and what we are not. And at this point in time, there are just, and this is somewhat encouraging, there are so many people that are just gung-ho for soccer and just enjoy the space so much. And I love it, but you know, you can only take so many L's and see so many downwards graphs and have so many cards go to 0 before it's not really fun anymore. And so does this change? I don't know. I mean, I assume it will at some point, but I think that the process to getting there isn't going to be an easy one, and it is going to come with a decent amount of pain for the individuals involved. So yeah, that's the state of modern, at least from my perspective. Would love to hear yours down below in a comment, what you think. If you enjoyed the video, do make sure to leave a like. It helps me, it helps the channel. If you want to see more videos like this as soon as I go live, make sure to subscribe. And with that said, hopefully you have a wonderful day, and peace.